Hello, my name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is presented by IDSA member Atos and CyberArk, entitled The Evolution of Ransomware. What does it mean for you? Before we get started, I want to discuss just a few quick logistics. We are recording today's discussion, so please make sure to share the link with your colleagues who may not be able to attend. There are several resources included in the attachment section of your portal, and that also includes slides for those that might be interested in downloading those. And then lastly, you are able to submit questions through the Q&A chat window. So if you have any as the discussion unfolds, we encourage you to submit them. Before I turn it over to our presenters today, I want to give a quick commercial for the Identity Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-defined security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members, who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. All of our resources are freely available on our website, idsalliance.org. So I encourage you to check back frequently for the latest blogs, upcoming webinars, and events. So let's get started. I'd like to turn things over to Alan Moffat, who is going to be our moderator today. Alan is an IDSA executive board member and Atos Global IAM practice lead. So with that, Alan, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for joining. Let me introduce the other panelists that we have joining us today. We have Anil Bamzai, who's also from Atos. Anil is the digital identity practice lead for Atos in North America. And we have Dave Adamczyk from CyberArk, who's the VP of Sales and Strategy for CyberArk. All right, so we want to talk a bit about ransomware today. Ransomware has kind of evolved over time. It's been around for a while. With minor impacts, leading up to really as we were approaching 2013 when the anonymous payment methods, started to be introduced, and that, gave the attackers a lot of motivation and a lot more freedom around how to get paid for their activities, and that led to a lot further proliferation of the ransomware. There were some other things that have happened over the course of time. The emergence of Bitcoin, some other activities, nation states getting involved, things like that. We've seen the impact of ransomware dramatically increase, exponentially, really, over the course of time. From the early 2000s up to 2020 and 2021. So let's take a closer look at that. All right, in 2019, in terms of cyber insurance, to address ransomware, we saw just a small number of companies actually purchasing the standalone ransomware insurance. The average claim was very small, along the lines of 84K, and the premiums were increasing just minimally at 3%. There was some loss related to ransomware as we were looking at going from 2018 to 2019, but overall the cyber insurance industry was still profitable around that time. Okay, in 2020 that started to change, especially as we got into COVID and some of the changes related to COVID. So we started to see ransomware attacks grow. Some of that came through the additional attack vectors introduced by so many people, adjusting to working remotely and some of the challenges related to that. Globally, that growth was around 62%. In North America, in particularly, that was around 158%. So very significant growth of ransomware attacks. There was over 2 million phishing sites, as of January in 2021, up 27% over the course of a year. The average loss per claim expanded. So instead of being the very low number we saw in 2019, up to over 350K in 2020. The average cost of the breach also increased significantly. 4.2 million in the U.S. and actually reaching over 8 million in 2020. What we also saw was 80% of the IT security leaders were actually realizing or acknowledging that their organizations were not prepared for these cyber attacks, in spite of having increased or significant investments in cybersecurity over the time. And that actually has increased or continued as we went into 2021. Uh, Cyber insurance, actually, the loss ratio increased, and all the way up to 67% as we got towards the end of the year. The top insurers formed another company, CyberAccuView, to coordinate this risk analysis of the ransomware attacks and how to mitigate that risk. And so there were some actions that were starting to be taken as we get into 2021. These stats, so 47%, the percentage of companies that were purchasing this insurance were increasing. The premiums were actually going up, with the proliferation of the ransomware attacks. First half of 2021 was an explosion of ransomware attacks like we haven't seen before. So some of the premiums increasing up to 300% in some cases. The average claim, again, continuing to go up. And as a result, there were several activities that were taking place. So the White House actually announced the ransomware task force and introduced that. The cyber insurance industry started to, they were determined to become profitable, and the way to do that, they had to institute some changes. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about today. All right. And the other point is that, this really impacts everyone. You'll see different statistics depending on which source you're looking at. But what you'll see consistently is that the primary targets are, healthcare, the services companies, things like that. We're starting to see even critical infrastructure is vulnerable, as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline attack. So that is, definitely something everyone needs to be aware of and be taking a look at. So let's get right into it, and get to our panelists and start talking through some of these topics in a little more detail. So Dave, let's start with you. How does an organization get infected with ransomware in the first place?
Sure. Thanks, Alan, and appreciate the overview to get started. And that's really the question that's not only been posed that our organizations are looking at, but it's also a question that the insurers are really now focused on trying to understand. Because when we're looking at this, phishing is nothing new, as Alan showed. How is it that phishing is still resulting in organizational breaches? And there is more phishing training, and phishing training is definitely something that we need to keep up. But if there's one lesson that I've learned from phishing training, is that somebody always clicks. I was working with an organization the other day, and they said in our last phishing test, it was our general counsel who clicked twice. So the attacks are getting better. The English is getting better. It's working. And as Alan said, over 2 million registered phishing sites with Google. So point is, people are always going to click. But the next question we want to ask is, why is it that if I click and I'm a business user and my laptop is compromised, my laptop should be a very low value asset in the organization. My laptop should not be the reason why there's an organizational breach. And a lot of organizations have taken additional steps to secure those endpoints, and solutions like EDR are very important. But as we saw with SolarWinds, in the response to the Senate hearing, it was, why didn't EDR stop this? And the answer was, because in SolarWinds, as in most breaches, the bad guys had admin rights. And once you have admin rights, there's nothing that can be done. So what we really want to do is we want to mitigate that risk. And again, seems to be a very simple solution. We can go into AD and we can remove admin rights. The problem is the ramifications associated with that. Number one, there's a feeling from people that they can't do their job. And number two, even basic tasks, like I'm out at visiting a customer and I want to project, and I walk into their conference room, and instead of a wire connected to the projector, there's a dongle. And when I plug that dongle into my laptop, I have to install some software, and that requires admin rights. If I travel and I'm moving to a different time zone and I want to add a printer, that requires admin rights. If I'm now working from home and I need to add a printer, that requires admin rights. And if we remove admin rights carte blanche, every one of these activities results in a help desk call. So organizations then took the second approach to say, okay, let's see if we can remove admin rights from as many people as possible. Right? Let's take all of our business users and let's remove admin rights. And then get down to a small group of exceptions. But when we did that, we found out that common exceptions might be senior sysadmins, developers, application owners, or maybe we have a legacy application. Maybe our finance team uses a legacy application, and this legacy application does require admin rights to run. Right? So in this case, they would create exception buckets for these folks. And in many cases, they would provide compensating controls, i.e., we'll do some additional phishing training so that developer will not be the one who's compromised. And at that point, we feel very good about ourselves. We've really made a good step forward. But then comes a slightly more advanced attack looking at social engineering. So worked with an organization who had achieved just these goals. I think they had achieved about 85% removal of admin rights. And in this case, the developer is one of the groups who received an exception because the developers had to run. They needed to be able to, they couldn't be holding up business. And in this case, bad guy just went on LinkedIn and found out who the developers were, then went on Facebook and found an engineer who was interested in robotics. Sent that developer an email as a college student. A couple emails go back and forth. Now we've got a mentor-mentee relationship. And now the bad guy sends over an email with a robotics attachment project attached to it. Can you just take a look at my robotics project? So people are trusting, and all of that work, the developer clicked on it, the developer's laptop was compromised, and the ransomware got in. More and more, we're looking at external third parties, vendors who are working on our systems. And those folks, again, we don't own their laptop. So setting up VPN and security can be even more challenging for those pieces. So when we look at those three buckets, there's a lot of opportunity for the bad guy and a lot of difficulty to be able to change that. So let's take the next step and say, all right, if we can't stop the bad guys from attacking, how is it that laptop resulted in an organizational breach? And if I were the person that clicked on the link, and I have in the past, I click on the link and my laptop's compromised. I'm a business user. My laptop being compromised should have no impact on CyberArk. However, and that's true, the bad guy doesn't care about me. I'm a business user. My domain account isn't going to buy them very much. However, maybe help desk logged into my laptop to troubleshoot an issue. Maybe there's an automated process that logs into my laptop to run some sort of a task. Well, much like me, when they log in and they log out with their credentials, they leave a hash behind. And because that member of the help desk probably has more access than me, that person's hash is more valuable. So they'll grab that hash and cross the boundary from tier 2 workstations into tier 1 servers. Or if I don't have admin rights on my laptop, but maybe we have the same local admin credential on all of our laptops. So now if one's compromised, they're all compromised. And the bad guy can start moving laterally laptop to laptop until they do find that credential. And then once they move from tier 2 to tier 1, it's the same rinse and repeat. Now they're going to go server to server to server, looking for whether it be a person, maybe a service account, maybe an automated process, maybe a third-party tool like a CMDB or a vulnerability scanner who's logging in with a domain admin credential. They're able to leverage that domain admin credential to traverse from tier 1 to tier 0. And at that point, for our on-prem organization environment, they own it. Once you own the domain controller, you can be anyone, anywhere, and then start pulling out data. As we make the migration to our cloud, our new tier 0 becomes those cloud consoles. Or if we have our CI/CD tools deploying instances, now the consoles to those CI/CD tools become our tier 0s. So how can we make sure that the bad guy is not going to be able to traverse and get to that tier 0? Right? So that's really what we want to focus on, is those two areas. Is okay, from the insurance perspective, it's all right, if we're looking at the breaches and we know the endpoint is coming into play, we know that the privileged accounts are always coming into play, and in many cases, the bad guys are trying to pull the backups out because that's a nice, easy way to be able to get access to all of that data. That's where they really want to start. So once we understand why a laptop being or an endpoint being compromised can result in a breach, then we can look at some foundational controls that we can put in to secure that. And that's where both security organizations and now cyber insurers are really focused on being able to focus on those foundational security challenges and work together to be able to address them.
All right, that's great. Thanks, David. Neil, do you have anything to add to that? What do you think some of the most common attack vectors are? Yeah, Neil, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry for that. Yes, are you guys able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, David kind of touched upon all the aspects of it. I think that one important thing I would like to touch upon is the user training aspect of overall game. It most of the times it does start with, like David was emphasizing on that workstation, that where it starts from. I think that's the key, and that translates to user training. We absolutely want to make sure organizations are doing enough in that area so that they train end users and make sure, what looks suspicious, if it looks suspicious, don't touch it and report it. And now organizations do have tools in place incorporated into, integrated into your email clients and other applications where you can go and literally click and notify security organizations within your companies, right? I think that training piece is very important in addition to the tools that we put in place.
Okay, yeah, just to summarize a little bit what you guys were saying. So the user training is really to address some of the most common attack vectors around phishing and social engineering, while also looking out for some of the new attack vectors, things like supply chain attacks and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
And Neil, another question for you. So how can an organization protect itself against ransomware? Once they've been exposed, what can they do?
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of things. There's prevention and then there is mitigation, right? There's a lot of things in today's hyper-connected world, when organizations are putting up a lot of services and products online on some digital platform. With the result, they're kind of exposing themselves to a lot of bad actors out there. I like to kind of introduce a word which is modern day security basics. We always talk about security basics, but modern day security basics is where we don't pretend to be safe when we put something at the periphery of the network and some kind of firewall or something and assume we're safe. Because times have changed, sophistication attacks have changed. We need to think in terms of a bad actor is already inside our network, and we need to think in those terms and design our security accordingly. Our security architect, security, the groups or application security teams, they need to incorporate this thinking into their design and architecture, that a bad actor is already in there, and they design accordingly, right? I'm kind of alluding to zero trust here, but we'll come to that a little bit later. But for now, let's kind of go over some of the things that organizations should be doing to protect themselves from these things happening. And if it happens, what do we do to kind of mitigate the impact? And David already touched upon and some of them. To start with, I think the first and the foremost is multi-factor authentication. We're all familiar with multi-factor authentication. Something we have, something we know, and use those factors for authentication. But I think with the sophistication of these attacks, we absolutely want to make sure, first of all, you have put at the, in my experience, there are still organizations that really don't have a multi-factor solution in place, yet they expose their services to external world clients, vendors, and their users. So first of all, make sure you have one. And second, in addition to the factors that we have been using for years, add additional layer to it. Something that you are was essentially, some kind of biometrics or maybe a push notification to your phones, and make it a little bit more difficult for bad actors to gain access to your applications. That's one. The second thing I want to touch upon is generally identity and access management hygiene. What I mean by that is, most of the times the organization will put in place a lot of identity and access management tools, but automation is missing. If things aren't automated, we're leaving it to the humans or people changing things over the period of time, and things kind of fall through the cracks, and we open up gaps because of that. For bad actors to come, whether it is the access over the period of time, that the access policy that are changing over the period of time, or we're not doing enough in terms of governance, who has access to what, right? We absolutely need to make sure that everything from IT and access management perspective is automated, is based on policies, based on criteria that have been put in place. So, for example, a classical example is, a human account or a service account, for that matter, was created for a reason. But if it is not automatically deprovisioned after the user is done or the person has moved on, it stays there forever, and hence kind of creates a gaping hole, right? We need to make sure we're following those industry standard best practices from identity and access management perspective. I think we can push the same thing to general security domain as well. General security hygiene, which is essentially, make sure the operating systems are up to date, make sure workstations are up to date from security patches point of view, right? All the applications are updated with their Vendors come up with, based on what's happening in the marketplace, vendors come up with security patches and whatnot. We want to make sure that those patches are applied timely, and we don't leave any holes out there so that we invite these bad actors to come in. I'm going to expand upon a little bit from identity and access management perspective, which is privileged access management. In last many years, most, I don't have the percentage off the top of my head, but most attacks that happened, some kind of privileged account was used to either infiltrate or then kind of go around the network and move horizontally. We want to make sure that organizations are aware of this and they are doing something to prevent this. So privileged access management is the classical way to prevent those security accounts, make sure passwords are changing, make sure what's regarding the sessions, make sure the things are being audited, and more importantly, this auditing and alerting in place so that if at all anything happens, we're alerted as quickly as possible. So I think in today's world, privileged access management is absolutely necessary for every organization to have. There is no way around it, particularly if you are using, every organization uses privileged access, so we definitely need to make sure we have it. And actually, David kind of touched upon the endpoint security, which is an absolute important from a ransomware perspective, from malware perspective, right? We want to make sure we have something in place that protects. There's a lot of products and tools in place right now that protects the endpoints, the workstation, the servers. First of all, we make it difficult for a bad actor to drop a payload or ransomware or something, malware payload, into the workstation, where we put in policies in place that defines that action as not normal, right? So we make sure that that action actually is denied access, or it doesn't happen at all because policies are in place. Even if that happens, and then we have policies in place that prevents the horizontal movement of that action, right? So what we're doing, because of that endpoint privileged management, endpoint security, we're actually mitigating the impact, and it doesn't go across. And we know it's localized; we can tackle it very, very easily. Not very easily, but we can at least tackle it. We know what's going on. And in fact, those products and platforms, they have alerting mechanisms in place, right? There's auditing in place. We will get to know quicker than we used to in past. I'll touch upon data governance. Even though data governance is a huge topic, it can be a session by itself. For that matter, all of these topics can be a session by itself. But quickly, from every organization, from the risk management framework perspective, data governance has to be part of it. There is no way around it, because you need to make sure, depending upon the type of organizations you have, whether you have client data, you have some kind of PII, or do you have health information data or other information that your organization deems that is important for them, we want to make sure that that data is not easily accessible to external actors. First of all, how is data stored? Is it encrypted online, on disk, whether it is hybrid, whether it is cloud, or whether it is on-prem? How is data stored? That is the most important thing. And if we have some kind of data governance tools in place, is data obfuscated? If it's an SSN, if there is a SIN in place, is the data available? The answer is no, it shouldn't be available. In a worst case scenario, if an attack happens and data is compromised and data is taken hostage in that situation, if I know that, even if they take this data, it's not going to be of any use to them, because I know this data was encrypted, this data was obfuscated. It's not going to be of any use to them, right? I will probably walk away from the situation and actually reformat the disk and move on. I'm kind of thinking in an ideal situation here, but that's possible when we have those tools in place. When I know the system compromised, that data cannot be read, that cannot be used or sold anywhere else, right? That will really help if we have a tool like that in place. Extending the same thought, backups are very important. If this thing happens, I wipe out everything, I have to back it up from somewhere, right? Backup and recovery, very important aspect of overall risk management framework. More importantly, all the data that we have, from whether it is customer data or whatever your organization deems data, the data, most important data for them, we want to make sure that data is backed up very frequently, and more importantly, there is sort of an air gap between where the data is stored and where your network is. Because if at all your network is compromised, your system or server or whatever is compromised, that backup is not compromised at all. So if we are kind of wiping out the data and we are pulling the data back in, we need to make sure that is not impacted in that situation. I think that's really important. And more importantly, most of the times what happens is, and this is my personal experience as well, we do take backups, but we never practice the recovery. right? Let's make sure that we are practicing the data recovery in our dev systems or our test environments, so that we know when need be, we're able to actually recover data and get to the point or close to the point when these attacks happened. Very important. The next I'm going to talk about, touch upon, the regulatory compliance or organizational compliance or security controls that organizations have in place or may not have in place. Depending upon what type of organization you are, there may already be some compliant regulations that you have to be compliant with, whether federally or state or even over your own organization. Even if there is nothing in there or you don't really have any mandates like that, make sure you go out and look at different, different available security frameworks, whether you talk about NIST or ISO 27001, NYDFS, or let me think, MITRE Matrix. Go and look at them and see what you have already in place and what do these security frameworks kind of recommend to do, and create that gap analysis, right? You don't really need a big consultant to come in and tell you that. You can do that yourself and run through these security controls and see what these gaps are. And if you see those are gaping holes that you still have in your environment, work on it, fix it, and make sure those areas are covered. We already talked about the user training, so I'll kind of add one more element to this, which is most of the times when we do security implementations, we tend to have pushback from business whether we want to put some things in place, and we have pushback from business. That's exception. It will take 2 more months or whatever the time to implement. We want to make sure we're done quickly, the system is available quickly, and there are exceptions that are put in place, right? And these exceptions can potentially be gaping holes, right? I think businesses have power most of the times in these situations, but I think we as security consultants, security organization, we want to make sure we make them understand what this exception could potentially mean, right? Create some kind of security framework, create some kind of security sort of risk number, and show it to them. And if you ask me, even push it to the extent that you assign some kind of dollar, I know it's kind of difficult to do, but assign some kind of dollar amount to the exception that is being asked for, right? In case a cyber attack is to happen, and this is what we're putting in an exception, and it could essentially translate into a situation where we'll have to pay a certain amount of dollars. And it has, most of the times in case of cyber attacks, as we know, brand is on the line, the reputation of the company is on the line, right? So make sure those exceptions, first of all, we don't have those exceptions at all, but if it happens, those are addressed as soon as we can. Those are not left there. There's a lot of other things we can actually talk about, whether it is boundary protection, MDR, or the DLP, data exfiltration. There's lots of things that an organization can do before these things happen. But in the interest of time, I will stop here. I'll pass it back to Alan.
All right, thanks, Neil. Dave, do you have anything to add?
Sure, thank you. Great summary. And what I see is oftentimes the exceptions are what can come back to really bite us. So we look at 2 critical ones with the endpoint, when we make the exception for a certain subset to have admin rights. Or when we look at managing, or when we look at multi-factor authentication, a lot of organizations have made an exception for shared privileged accounts, because a shared account like a root or an SA or local admin isn't tied to a person. So MFA became a challenge without a PAM solution. So a lot of organizations would say, okay, we're not going to do it for that. But what happened in reality is those developer senior sysadmins laptops are actually the most valuable ones, as are the privileged accounts. So when we get to that 80% and we leave that 20%, if we want to look at the profile, the persona of that 20%, and understand that persona, even though the odds of that person resulting in an incident is lower, what is the cost of their laptop, or what is the cost of that admin account? And then we can focus our valuable time on going after the biggest risk reduction for the least effort first, and then being able to move out from there. So that's all I had to add. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dave. I'll add a couple of things to what you guys have said. So in terms of multi-factor authentication, one of the things we still see too frequently is where organizations use multi-factor authentication for access externally or for third parties to access, but they don't use it internally or for access to internal applications. And that's a whole. If you're looking at things like from a zero trust perspective, you want to address that as well and make sure you're enforcing multi-factor authentication everywhere. The other topic that was brought up a few times is the topic of exceptions, and this is something that's really key. What we see very frequently is it's these exceptions that get put in place. The example that Dave mentioned about admin access to shared accounts that aren't tied to a specific person, or it could be a portion of the population that feels like their business is being impacted if they have to follow these controls. You've got to make sure that those controls are enforced, or there are mitigating controls in place, particularly when we're talking about things like privileged access. The reality is this is how the attackers are getting in and how they're getting to the things that matter in the organization. If it's just someone clicking on a phishing email and they don't have access to anything, they're not going to get to anything important. They have to be able to move laterally and get to something that matters. And then if it's one of these individuals that has the exception and they happen to have this access, that's just going to make the attacker's job easier. So it's very important to address that. And the other thing around the controls that you do have implemented, Neil had mentioned this, relative to backup and recovery, and making sure that not only do you have that in place, but that's tested. You want to test your other security controls as well. And we've run into cases where if we're helping a customer after an incident, what we end up finding is that there are controls in place, but something was missed. There's a gap. If they're not tested, you're not going to find that until it's too late. So you want to make sure to regularly test those controls. So on to the next question here. So Dave, this one's for you. So how has cyber risk insurance providers changed their offerings over the past 12 months in response to this growing ransomware threat?
Hey, Dave, we can't hear you right now.
Dave, are you still with us, or did you almost look like you locked up and dropped? All right, he's rejoining. There you go, Dave. Are you back?
Sorry about that. Right on cue, right?
Absolutely. All right. Did you catch the question, or do you want me to? Let me repeat it just to be sure. So how have cyber risk insurance providers changed their offerings over the past 12 months in response to this growing ransomware threat that we talked about?
Sure. So, Alan,
Yeah, let's yeah, I think Dave's trying to join one more time.
sorry about that. I have no idea. Bright Talk keeps kicking me out, but hopefully this will last. So
Right.
to answer the question, to your point, cyber insurance was a very small piece of the insurance business. About 7 carriers had 90% of the market back in 2019, and it was a profitable industry. And 2019, the increase in costs were almost seen as an outlier, and nothing really changed. But moving into 2020, that's when the insurers really started to have some very, very significant losses. And we had a perfect storm of increased losses, increased amount of losses, and 3, an increase in the number of organizations who were looking for cyber insurance. Because obviously, as the number of ransomware attacks went up, the number of organizations interested in purchasing ransomware insurance increased. So at that point, the easy lever to pull is to simply say, okay, we are going to raise premiums. However, the amount that the premiums would need to be raised to able to A, compensate for the cost this year, and B, starting to look into the future, if the number of attacks continue to grow, the insurers realized that raising premiums was not the only lever that could be pulled. Eventually, the premiums would be so high that it wouldn't be worth it. and self-insure would be better than going for that premium. So the insurers know that they have to work together to be able to toe that line of when that insurance premium is going to be a value add and when it is going to be too much. So at that point, the insurers realized that they really needed to start getting involved and helping their customers to be able to come up with a framework. And you mentioned that company CyberArk View that was created. You mentioned the ransomware task force. That's pulling some of the brightest minds to put together and come up with that framework. So it was a combination of premiums going out, carve outs for certain pieces. You know, I saw situations where ransomware was actually being covered under kidnapping because the old policies weren't written correctly. So the policies are written more clearly, but they're also being able to give guidance. So now we're coming up with specific requirements that the insurance provider is providing, i.e., are you using multi-factor? Are you using multi-factor for all privileged accounts? Are you protecting your backups, your immutable backups? Are you removing admin rights on workstations? And now that they're putting these requirements in place, that's going to allow them to maintain profitability without having premiums go through the roof. The challenge to organizations looking at it is cyber insurance used to be a matter of, well, put your name and your date of birth and you're going to get your cyber insurance policy. And a lot of organizations were expecting that. The treasurer, whoever opens up that policy, was expecting the same renewal as last year. And now they're met with these additional requirements. And that's where there's some panic going on, because now that treasurer is going over to the CISO saying, can I say yes to these pieces? And in many cases, they cannot say yes to all of them. And what we found, though, is that from an insurance company, the underwriter wants to be able to provide you with that policy. They just have to have the assurances. So on those areas where we can't just put a simple yes, being able to then meet with that underwriter and talk them through, yes, we're not doing that today, but this is what we are planning to do. This is the timeline that we're going to be doing it, and then being able to move forward and getting that policy. So it's now moved from the onus really just being all on one side to a shared responsibility. And the final piece of that, we're spending a lot of time as CyberArk with the insurers, because the insurers, just like the organizations, nobody has a limited time and resource. A lot of companies were not planning to take these steps until that cyber insurance bill came up. So how can we be able to look at mitigating these risks, putting these foundational security controls in place, but not coming at the expense of operational efficiency? So I find that when we look at each one of these controls, we want to think of the three legs to the stool. Yes, there's increasing security, and we want to be able to measure that for the board as well. You know, those questions are being asked. We need to say not only that we've implemented a solution like CyberArk, but that we're providing measurable risk reduction. Second, we want to be able to look at what that's going to take from an operational standpoint. Are we going to have to retrain users? Are we going to change people's workflow? Because security cannot come at the expense of keeping the light on. And third, can we now be compliant with not only cyber insurance, but our other compliant regulations as they go forward? So taking that step-by-step approach, working directly with that insurance carrier, as well as your security vendors, being able to pull that together and provide that plan. Even if you're not compliant today, that plan in place is able to get you where you need to be.
Okay, Dave, a quick follow-up on that. How have you seen that impact the payment of ransomware? So the ransom demand.
Yes. So payouts were very quick in the past. Now they're being scrutinized. So now when they're looking at the payouts, when the payouts are too high over what they expected, now getting into the fine print, are we actually covered for this? So the amount of time to do that analysis, the amount of bad news to say, oh, you're not actually covered for this, is going up. So that time to get that payment and that ability to get that payment, and then also thirdly, the carve out. So solar wind. So now a carve out's been put out to say, hey, now if you're subject to any of these three aspects that previously would have been covered after solar winds, that's now a carve out. So the time and the effort has definitely increased significantly over the past year.
Yep. Anil, anything to add from you?
I think David pretty much covered it. One thing I would kind of add to it is, it's only a few high-profile attacks that are pushing these insurance companies to make all these changes, right? And I don't see that stopping in future as well. So the organization will have to do a lot in that area.
Okay. Neil, another question for you. So
sure.
Are these requirements that Dave mentioned for cyber risk insurance, are these sufficient? or do you think organizations need to do more than just meeting those requirements?
I think the short answer is no, it's not enough. Organizations have to do way more than they are doing right now, and insurance companies, in a way, are facilitating that now. Last year in 2020, I believe, organizations who actually went out and bought cyber insurance went from 26% to 47%, which kind of tells you it's almost double, right? So which tells you where the organizations are right now from their overall IT risk management, not IT, but overall risk management perspective. As I said, there's only a few high-profile attacks where they have to shell out a lot of money. Insurance companies have to shell out a lot of money. It changes the whole paradigm. It changes the whole cybersecurity insurance business, right? And in some cases, these insurance companies actually stopped giving up cyber insurance policies because it's just not workable for them. And in some cases, they have made it really, really, really stringent to get the policy. They have an appraisal process in place where they will look at your controls and the security and this incident response mechanisms in place before they actually will give you the insurance. We know the whole cybersecurity landscape is changing, right? And so are these insurance companies as well. What they have done is what insurance companies are doing now, they will come up with a questionnaire, and you will have to kind of go through that questionnaire and look at all aspects of people, process, technologies, right? What kind of mechanisms do you have in place to mitigate all these risks that you have? In fact, some of the controls that they are looking at now, is it's for the audience as well. They look at your IAM controls, not just one small thing, but broad IAM controls. What do you have in place, so that they can come up with a risk score that kind of defines that organization and defines the premiums that this organization will pay. And not only that, it's the alignment with the best practices, industry security standards, the privileged access management controls in place. What have you done from, if there is a cyber attack, what have you done? In fact, one thing I will touch upon there is, organizations should kind of bring in cyber recovery planning as part of their risk framework, overall risk management framework. It's not after the fact. You should be aware of that service, or in fact bring that organization, bring that company who should provide the service into the fold, so you are aware of it. Insurance companies want to be compliant with whatever industry standards you need to be compliant with from industry perspective, whether it's multi-factor authentication, they look at that. All these things, they kind of ask you for in that question to determine the risk score and hence the premiums. The best part, or however you want to look at it, now insurance companies are actually pushing organizations to do all these things, which is in a way good, because that is good for organizations to reduce their exposure, to reduce the impact. So in short, I'll come back to the question, which is essentially, is it enough? No, it's not. Organizations need to do more.
Okay, and we actually have a question from the audience here. So let's see if you can take a stab at this one first, Dave. Regular backup should mitigate the damage ransomware poses. What are the caveats of this mitigation technique?
So regular backups. So when we have backups, we want to make sure the backups are secured, and as Anil mentioned, that they're separate from the system. Because when the bad guy gets in, we don't want them to just be able to pull the backups. So yes, securing those backups is one of those foundational pieces. But if I am able to, for example, get to the domain controller and be domain admin, now I can get anywhere within the organization. So that's where we want to look at that. We want to say, yes, that is a critical piece. The bad guy is, no different than any other person doing their job. They're looking for the easiest way to do their job, right? Mm-hmm. And they're going to follow that checklist. And if they really want to get something and they can't get to the backups, that where everything's all consolidated together, they do have the ability to just start going through and moving laterally through the organization. So backups are a key component, but not a silver bullet.
Yeah, and one of the things we already mentioned is you have to verify the backup. You have to test your recovery procedure from those backups. If you have backups and you can't use them for recovery, they're not very helpful, right? So make sure you understand what you're going to be able to recover from those backups ahead of time and do that. All right, so let's go on to the next question here. So Dave, for you, is there an overall upside to what's going on now with the cyber insurance industry?
Yes, there's definitely an upside to this. So if we look at the future, I mean, if it's not going to change, if we look at the total cost, they're looking at 5.2 trillion in losses the next 3 years, according to Accenture. So it's only going to go up. So what better time to stop and say, okay, yes, we want to increase security, but we can't do that at the expense of operational efficiency. And that's where we're spending probably the most time working with organizations is how do we put together a security plan that's actually feasible? That's not some pie in the sky dream that we get 2 steps in and then we don't get there. How can we put a plan that we can really achieve in a defined amount of time, and achieve that plan without operational inefficiency and people screaming and pushing back? So to give you an example, is removing admin rights has been a going around the circle. We try to do it, we fail, we open it back up, we open it up hashway, we go around that circle. How can we make sure the next time we go around that circle that we're not going to get 3/4, a half, 80% of the way and have to stop? And that's really where we're spending time with the organization to say, okay, with MFA, if we can't do it on our own, let's look at being able to have a tool that can give me an admin token to add a printer and change the time, but not give me full admin rights. Let's be able to factor in our developers and know that whitelisting and blacklisting isn't going to work because it hasn't worked in the past, and say, before we try it again, we need to mitigate that risk. And what I mean by mitigate it with our clients found that gray listing, for example, was the way to say, okay, a senior sysadmin does have the ability to install whatever they want on their laptop, but if they do install an untrusted application, when that untrusted application decides to go out to the internet, ransomware to get the encryption key to encrypt the hard drive, that's where that untrusted application is going to start. How can we be working together with the business to make sure we're moving forward? And that's what I'm seeing is probably the biggest change that's going on. And also from the vendor, we found that organizations really push back on us. So for example, when we told Linux admins they had to go to a web interface to get credentials, they very correctly pushed back and said, if we're going to ask Linux admins to leave their shell and go to a web interface, it's going to be a very challenging uphill battle. And instead of focusing on security, people are going to be focused on trying to find ways around it. But if we can pull those Linux admins into the room and say, okay, if you're able to stay within your shell and you understand the risk, is this feasible, right? So even when you're working with the vendor, don't look at it as a holistically, we have our IT environment, breaking it down to the pieces, understanding the workflow of those those DBAs, those Linux admins, those developers, those cloud architects, and making sure the security controls are in line with their job. And that's what I'm seeing is the big change. It used to be the audit stick or the security stick. You must do this. And if you don't, sorry, that's all there is to it. Now it's a much more collaborative process. And as a result of that, I'm seeing security programs accelerate and being much more successful. And then instead of starting over again, we're now able to move on to the next chapter, the next phase. And as these attacks become more only continue to grow, as the cyber insurance and other compliance grow, if we wait 3 years until the requirements get even more stringent, we're going to have that much more technical debt. So now is a great time to hit the pause. Let's make we get the foundational security so that next year we can anticipate that we're going to be able to grow at a first and a second floor instead of pouring a new foundation year after year.
Yeah, you made a great point, Dave, talking about the usability, because if you make a security control difficult to use, as you mentioned, the first thing someone's going to try to do is find a way around it. And that's where you're going to get stuck with all of these exceptions and things like that. So finding something, implementing it in a way that's not going to introduce the friction is actually, it's critical to the success of that security control for sure.
One last point is, also to consider, a lot of organizations are going through their cloud transformation, but most organizations still have their on-prem data center. So there's those lucky few who were born in the cloud and have 100% and nothing behind. But as we're looking at this, considering both sides, now there are probably going to be different discussions with different people within the organization, different personas, but making sure that what we're doing for on-prem is also going to be able to apply to cloud, that we're not going to have to set up different security controls and tools for each one, adding another set of silos and even more difficulty moving forward.
Right. Neil, anything to add from you? Okay, go ahead.
I was going to add one more point, which is, David touched upon the security planning aspect of this, right? Organizations or, security, the organizations, when they are doing their planning, what's coming up a few years ahead of the line, if there's a roadmap in place or trying to put in place, I think one thing definitely they need to make sure is from the cyber attacks and the cyber insurance point of view, look at what are the requirements from these insurance companies as well. Keep that in mind and plan accordingly, right? Down the line, it's said it's only increasing, it's not going anywhere. We want to make sure we're in compliance with what these insurance companies are requiring you to do to make sure you get a better premium and you are actually able to insure your company.
Okay. And then I guess the next question for you, Anil. So what's next with all of this? Where is all of this headed with this explosion of ransomware and the response from the insurance industry? And what's next?
I think I don't have to be a genius to say that there is no sign in sight that tells us it will stop in future, right? It won't. I think with remote work, more and more online services, COVID pushing us to the brink, it's only increasing from here on, whether there are political agendas or otherwise, the attacks are increasing over the period of time. And I think the worst part of this is, we catch up and then they move a step ahead of us, right? Sophistication of attacks is increasing exponentially. We need to kind of gear up ourselves towards that and be prepared for it. All the things that we talked about today, those are absolutely important from organizational security point of view. But there's more things that can be done to make sure that we're secure. We're trying to prevent and mitigate. That said, there is all the things that can be put in place. We need to kind of go back and relook at these things. The new platforms, new tools, new applications, security particularly, that are coming up in the marketplace. There are a few things that are being added to it. Whether it is AI, it is ML, machine learning, or analytics. Let's look at the tools. There's a lot of tools in the marketplace now that they are bringing in these technologies into security platforms, where we can actually look at, if an anomalous behavior is happening, we have some kind of machine learning and artificial intelligence in place that can actually detect it really quickly, so that we can mitigate the risk, we can reduce the expansion of whatever the bad actor was trying to do. I think we definitely need to keep those tools in place and keep exploring more and more that are bringing these additional technologies in place. And I'll add one more last comment here is, within our security organizations, or when you're talking to your vendors and consultants and whatnot, bring up zero trust architecture, zero trust principle. Everything that you're putting, or you're relooking at what you already have, or new things that you're trying to put in place, put that secure zero trust hat on and think in those terms. Think a bad actor is already in your mind. What you do, like Alan, you touched upon earlier, right? The internal application, most of the times, internal HR and finance and whatnot, you just need a username and password to get into it, right? Let's make that secure. Let's make sure there's an MFA in front of it. Even push it to biometrics or things like that. Put that zero trust architecture in every new design that you're trying to put in place.
Okay, Dave? Yeah, over to you.
Absolutely, and also consider what's changed in the future. Right now everyone's focused on MFA and securing access to their servers and cloud consoles, but now when we look at Workday, and we look at Salesforce, and we look at more and more, we have previously business users who now have administrative rights to SaaS applications, which could result with real risk. So same way we talked about, making an operationally efficient workflow for those IT vendors, members of that staff, also starting to look at those business users who now have that privileged access. And the same thing, how are we going to ensure that their access to that web interface is secured? They can't copy, delete data, but in a way that's not going to require them to change their workflow, i.e. they need to stay in their browser. They can't go to another tool. They need to go to that Workday the same way they have before. How can, again, we start to think about those new use cases that are coming, those new crew of privileged accounts that are coming in, and being able to tie those into our programs as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that the threats are going to continue to increase. Things like bring your own device, Internet of Things, these kinds of things. The threats are just going to continue to increase, and we just need to stay on top of them. And like Anil was alluding to, using things like machine learning and behavior analytics and these types of things to detect threats that we don't know about yet. Right? It's one thing to put the tools in place to look at attack vectors that we see today. What about the ones that will come up tomorrow that we haven't seen before? We've got to prepare for those as well. All right. I guess that's we're about out of time, so we want to go ahead and I guess wrap up these questions. Is there any other questions from the audience, really quick, before we wrap up the session? All right. If no other questions from the audience, thank you everyone for joining. This session is recorded. It's going to be available on Bright Talk along with some other materials. So thanks again, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.